You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Sick of those trivia podcasts that you don't even understand how to operate and they just have too many levers and buttons?
There's got to be a better way.
Now there is, with Good Job Brain, an offbeat quiz show and trivia podcast that makes learning new things easy and fun.
I just learned that artificial vanilla flavoring sometimes comes from the anal glands of a beaver, and now I can never shake that mental image. Thanks, Good Job Brain.
Good Job Brain is available for the low price of just 4 easy payments of free. It's a podcast.
Good Job Brain is part of Airwave Media and available on all podcast apps. Operators are standing by.
I've probably mentioned before that I was obsessed with magic as a kid, rehearsing for hours in front of the mirror, performing shows in my backyard and at school, and spending all of my allowance on new tricks at a little magic shop in the seedy part of downtown Houston. Somehow, the best magic stores are never in the good neighborhoods. One of my favorite childhood memories is of the Saturday afternoon when my dad took me to see magician David Copperfield perform live and in person. This was the master of spectacle who had made the Statue of Liberty disappear into thin air, walked through the Great Wall of China, and levitated across the Grand Canyon. I really believed that there wasn't anything that Copperfield couldn't do. But it wasn't just his sense of the spectacular that left me in awe that day. He was different than most magicians. He wasn't just performing magic tricks, he was using magic to tell a story and illuminate universal truths. Perhaps that's why his career has endured for 5 decades, earning him countless awards and making him the most successful magician of all time. His passion for magic extends well beyond the stage, though. For years, David Copperfield has quietly been amassing the largest collection of magic memorabilia and magic history in the world. Warehoused in a secret location on the outskirts of Las Vegas, and available by invitation only to a privileged few magicians and magic historians. But now he's finally sharing some of his favorite pieces along with the stories behind them in his new book, David Copperfield's History of Magic. And today, my childhood hero joins me on the podcast to talk about his own beginnings as a kid magician, his original stage name, and what his first act was like. He reveals that his own heroes weren't magicians, but famous filmmakers and tap dancers, and he recalls getting to know and work with one of those heroes, the legendary Orson Welles. He discusses how he comes up with ideas for new illusions, everything that goes into building a working magic apparatus, and the 100-year evolution of his most famous magic trick, one that has been hailed by magicians as the greatest illusion of all time. David shares some of his favorite magic memorabilia in his collection, including some of Houdini's greatest escapes. We talk about some of the most famous names in the history of magic, including a con man who turned master mentalist, the tragic fate of the white man who billed himself as a famous Chinese conjurer, and the untold story of some of the women in magic. Plus, David recalls the magician who was his biggest influence and teases his next great illusion, coming up with master magician David Copperfield in just a moment. I'm totally thrilled to welcome magician David Copperfield to the show today. Best known for his combination of storytelling and illusion, his career of over 40 years has earned him 11 Guinness World Records, 21 Emmy Awards, a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a knighthood by the French government, as well as having been named a living legend by the U.S. Library of Congress. Now he's paying tribute to the magicians who came before him and sharing his own remarkable collection of magic memorabilia in his beautiful new book, David Copperfield's History of Magic. David Copperfield, welcome.
Good to be here with you. Thanks for that very nice intro.
You're welcome. David, I have to tell you, as a former child magician and a lifelong lover and collector of magic, it honestly is truly an honor
What was your magic name?
Ben the Great. In reality, I was Ben the Not So Great. But on the Cape, I was billed as Ben the Great. How about yours?
I was Divino, the boy magician.
I love that. That's way more original. I'll tell you, David, my dad took me to see your show in Houston about 40 years ago when I was probably about 7. And it is one of my favorite memories from childhood. And I remember just being blown away.
Like, what did I do in the show? Do you have memories of what?
I'll tell you, for me, it's interesting because it was not one of the big stage illusions that you're so well known for that really, really impressed me. But the one that stuck with me was sort of a rather scaled back bit with you. And it was either a scarf or a napkin at a dinner table. Do you remember that one?
Very, very well. It was done to Frank Sinatra all the way. It's a handkerchief that came to life and ended up reuniting me and a girl that was kind of pissed off at me. She left the table, and then the handkerchiefs kind of helped us get back together again. So we didn't have to use a handkerchief for tears.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember every bit as much as the magic. I appreciated the storytelling, the romance, even as a kid, and especially just the grace with which you performed that scene. And it was interesting to learn in your new book that your heroes growing up, they weren't magicians, but they were filmmakers like Orson Welles, and particularly dancers like Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire. Tell me about that.
All storytellers. I was good at magic, but my real dream was to tell stories and to make magic as to take what I did well, which was magic, and combine it with what moved me. I wish I could be Gene Kelly, but alive. I wish that Orson Welles I got to work with on my first special. All the creations of Frank Capra and Victor Fleming and great film directors. Orson, of course, what they did with moving an audience, I wanted to do with magic. Magic was good at amazing people, making people go, wow. But I wanted to go much more than that. I wanted to really communicate ideas. And even back then, when you were a kid, I'm glad you remembered little moments that wasn't just the magic itself. It was something a little bit more relationships. And it exists in every other art form but magic, relationships and stories about that. In music, we tell stories, or we can be familiar with those things. And in art, obviously, art that really resonates with people, it's because they find themselves in it. And I want the audience to find themselves in my show. And even this book, the whole book of the history of magic is about the stories of the individuals. It's not about the props. I'm sitting here in this museum filled with hundreds of thousands of things. But for me, that's not what's interesting. What's interesting is the stories about the challenges these people had, women and men, in magic to try to overcome obstacles.
Yeah, the book is just fantastic. And I want to get into some of those stories. But before we do that, I also want to talk a little bit about your own story. I'm curious, what drew you to magic when you were so young? Because, like me, you had a childhood love of magic. You actually made something of it. I didn't. I went into something else. But what was your original childhood act like when you were a kid?
Well, I was still learning. So I knew on the bad side, I did like all this kid show magic stuff. I made balloon animals, my parents let me put razor blades in my mouth and pull them out on a string. So maybe not the best parenting skills, but it's sitting behind me. The actual one is actually behind me over there. On the good side, I knew I should theme things. I did that act with light bulbs because a magician that I saw in the Ed Sullivan Show, whose career is displayed here in the museum, is Marvin Roy. Marvin Roy was Mr. Electric, and he produced light bulbs. Well, as a kid, you could buy certain things that replicated what he did, which is sort of unfortunate in a way, but allowed me to do kind of part of a bad version of his act. So I did a light bulb sequence, and I did my story with the stratosphere effect. It was about a family of brothers that were one misbehaved. And so I told stories about that. So it wasn't very original, the magic, but at least had an attempt to make it musical and make it storytelling, even as an 8 and 10-year-old.
And I love that you actually have a full-scale recreation of your favorite magic shop where you spent much of your youth in your museum there.
We start the museum like a story. It started right here, sitting here now. We're audio only, correct, on the podcast? But you can see behind me, this is all recreation of Tannen's magic. It's really, really amazing. And it's the beginning of my beginning. So it's the beginning of the tour. So it kind of made sense.
I always say, if you don't know that you're going to be a magician before probably about age 16, you're probably never going to be one. And it's one of those things where I never hear of someone who, graduated law school and suddenly decided they were going to go into the magic business. Is it pretty fair to say that every successful magician probably started with the love of magic when they were a kid?
I'm thinking now, it's a very good question. I haven't heard that before. So I think there are examples of people that begin and discover magic later in life and embrace it. Of the famous ones throughout history, that's a great question.
I mean, there are some people that you feature in the book who, come from a magic family that's gone through several generations, like the Masculins, who were a big magic family in England, right?
Correct. And, that is, like circus families that, if you're born a Wallenda, you're going to, when you're a child, you're going to be part of that world. In magic, I think it does exist. My kids have no interest in magic. Maybe it's a good thing. And I would push them to find their own, encourage them to find their own passion. I talked in my show about passion, preparation, and persistence, those 3 Ps, which is kind of what I followed as my mantra. I was very passionate about this magic stuff. Preparation was the second step. We're really learning about both the history and about all the technology and techniques, and the persistence, which is very important, as you know, in life for everybody. You have to be really persistent to make things happen because there's so many obstacles. And in magic, I'm inventing the piano every single time. I can't just compose a song on a piano like a songwriter. I have to invent a new piano, new technology every single time I do a piece of magic. So that's why the process is very, very long and challenging, but rewarding at the end.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because in this book, you seem to have a great respect for the design, the technology, the engineering that goes into these magic tricks, or I guess what you would call an apparatus as your preferred technical term. I want to know about that process without giving away too much. How do you come up with illusions? How does it make it from the idea in your head up to the stage?
It happens 2 ways. One way, I'll find a piece of technology that is amazing, or I'll invent a piece of technology and I'll say, what can I do with this? And how do I make this into something? And then the story comes afterwards. Then there's the other way, which is I'll have a dream of doing something, of accomplishing a certain effect, a certain goal, a certain result, and I'll work hard to find the technique or technology to create that. So it works both ways. In the same way you ask a songwriter, which comes first, the music or the lyrics, and they'll say the same thing, except Elton John probably gets the lyrics first and Bernie Taupin and then writes the song, and that's their system. In most cases, a musician will find a lick of music or a phrase of music that they like. They'll begin to write the lyrics after that. Sometimes words come first with the story that has to motivate it. So, magic is the same way for me. Sometimes it starts with technology or technique and invention, and then the story and everything comes after that. The result comes after that. And sometimes it's for a goal of an end result that I can picture that I have to problem solve to get to that end result.
I can't even imagine the skill set that one has to be able to come up with illusions, just because, you're part psychologist, part engineer, so many different aspects that must go into that.
You're correct. For me, I'm very lucky to have technology shown to me very early. New techniques, before you see it at CES, I get to see it early. I'm very fortunate. I have friends that bring me things like that. And I'm able to use it in my show, disguise it and use it in my show. And the process sometimes reinvent new things, invent new technology that isn't something that the public will see. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, eventually I won't be able to use those things because, public will start to learn about not the secrets, but they'll learn about the new things that are being offered for public consumption. In this museum and book, we talk about Robert Houdin. Robert Houdin was called the father of modern magic. He took magic off the streets and put it into a respectable setting. He invented the first smart home. Doors would open in his house by themselves. Today, every grocery store has doors that do that, but that was a magic effect. And many examples of that where magic effects have become part of our daily life.
I don't know if this is still the case, but I know it at least used to be the case that you could not patent an illusion or an apparatus. Is that still the case?
No, you can.
Oh, you can now. Okay.
Oh, yes. And you could in the past, too. The problem is the public gets to see it. So what I did was I would, patent inventions under farm equipment,
No kidding.
And just so I have the possession of the legal right of it. So you can do it, but the problem is people can see it.
Right. It gives away the trick.
Exactly. Houdini had the water torture cell. He escaped from the water torture cell. He tried to protect it. In magic, he couldn't protect it as a patent. But he did a play for one night using the water torture cell. And the play was called Challenged. He presented the illusion as a play, which was able to be did. But it didn't really help. Everyone ripped them off anyway. They stole it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great history of everyone ripping off each other's act and also building on each other's act. One thing that you talk about in this book is you're often taking older illusions and innovating and improving them for modern audiences. This really highlights not just the history of magic, but how every magician, including yourself, builds on the previous generation. And by way of example, you have your famous death saw illusion, which is essentially a 100-year journey from the original, sawing a woman in half illusion. Can you walk us through that evolution?
Sure. What an amazing idea to saw a human being in half. It captured people's imaginations. The first was done by P.T. Selbit, who actually passed the saw through a person. You wouldn't see it divided into two. The saw just passed through somebody. Then it went on to Horace Golden, who had a giant circular saw, and the saw would go through the person visibly. You'd see it happen, not inside a box. Then time passed, and Dante, the magician, and others had a couple of boxes where the person would be inside, and you'd separate the two boxes. You see the feet hanging out one side and the hands and heads sticking out the other side. And, Ricciardi, one of my favorite performing magicians, did the circular saw like Horace Golden did, with blood and guts, had blood spurting everywhere in the theater, and wouldn't put her back together, left her dead on stage. It's pretty incredible. But I did the death saw, which took the idea of sawing somebody in half, and I wanted it to be happening to myself. I was the victim. I didn't want to do it to a woman or a man. I wanted it to be happening to me. And I did it as an escape, where I'd have to escape from the blade. So when that saw would go through me, inevitably, the audience would get very upset because they were sure I was going to escape from these shackles and bonds on the table with totally no coverage. Saw would go through me and I'd be split into two pieces. Both of my halves are living halves. And I would put myself back together by turning time backwards. It was kind of taking all those other ideas and combining to one idea with a new technique, new technology. And, but if that didn't happen before, all this other technology, all those other techniques didn't happen before, the death saw wouldn't exist. And it still, I think, still holds up.
Yeah, I love how many layers there are to that. It's interesting because it sort of seems like Joseph Campbell, the great writer, he used to say that there are basically X number of myths out there that get retold and reworked over the years. Have you ever figured out exactly how many original magic tricks there are? Not original in the sense of being, different, but kind of the origins of magic.
People say there's only X number of pieces of magic or this many jokes in comedy, and I totally disagree with that. I really think you can really break out, and the sky's really the limit. And I've done it many times, We thought magic should happen on the stage. I took people and traveled them to Hawaii from the stage. So teleportation became a reality in a live setting. The Now You See Me movie started because a writer saw me do that and saw the potential. The magic could be credible as a transcontinental illusion. No, I think the possibilities are really endless, and you shouldn't limit yourself to these kind of rules that exist.
We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with more when we return in just a minute.
Hey, this is Mark Bittman. You might know me from How to Cook Everything or the New York Times or the Bittman Project. I cover all things food, from cooking to gardening to junk food, health, sustainability. You might say I'm obsessed with everything about food. And that's why I've started a podcast called, appropriately enough, Food. Each week on Food, I'll sit down with a different guest. We'll talk recipes, ingredients, and what you can do to help build a better food system. Food is the one substance that connects everything to everything else, and it connects us all. Not only can we not live without it, but we love it. So subscribe now to Food with Mark Bittman on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brian Keating, host of the Into the Impossible podcast and the Chancellor's Distinguished Professor of Physics at UC San Diego, where I study the origin and evolution of the universe. I believe scientists are obligated to explain our work in simple terms to non-experts, the people who fund our fascinating research. So I created the free university you can attend in your pajamas, taught by the world's brightest faculty. Best of all, you won't incur a dime of student loan debt, and there's no homework to complete. Every week, I put out a deep dive interview with important thinkers and authors like Andy Weir, Steven Pinker, and Michio Kaku. I've talked to 9 Nobel Prize winners like Sir Roger Penrose and Frank Wilczek, and talked to a few astronauts, including Commander Chris Hadfield of Major Tom fame and Dr. Jessica Meir, live from the International Space Station. I'm on a mission to magnify curiosity, stoke imagination, and inspire minds of all ages. Join me, because the only way to discover the limits of the possible is to go beyond them, into the impossible.
We've kind of hinted at this famous collection of magic that you have, but I want to tell the audience a little bit more about it. You have the largest collection of magic memorabilia, apparatus, books, props, costumes, which you house in a secret museum somewhere on the outskirts of Vegas. And I think I mentioned before this, for years I've dropped hints to every magician I know that I would love to see it. And so this book is just such a treat for me. You feature some of the best items, I should say, in this book. Tell us a little bit about the origins of this. How did this collection even begin?
Years ago, I got a call from a friend of mine who said they're going to sell the Mulholland Library. Mulholland Library was John Mulholland's archive of magic history. He had half of Houdini's library. It was given to him by Houdini. The other half went to the Library of Congress. He had books and, props and all kinds of things. Amazing collection. And I didn't really look at history, honestly, in the beginning. I was always so immersed in inventing new things. I didn't really look backwards. I knew enough about technique in magic, but I didn't really look at the stories of the people that came before me. Then when I acquired this thing, I started to realize these women and men lived my life before me. They did every challenge, every single thing that happened to me in my current life had happened before in magic history. And suddenly, because it was about individuals, it became very resonant to me. And I loved it. And I've quadrupled the size of the collection. So now it's this amazing Smithsonian-like museum, multiple stories, and it's really amazing. Incredible library, acquired lots of stuff. And it now means something because it's about these individuals that can actually teach us something. We can learn about how to not make the same mistakes in the future. Even though we keep making the same mistakes as human beings, we keep doing the same thing over and over. We keep moving forward a little bit, but it's incredible. It's a mirror of what we go through today.
Yeah, and it really is something incredible that you've done here because, you have essentially preserved the entire history of your own art. It's hard to imagine, Elton John or someone, building an enormous collection in a museum that is the entire history of music.
Yeah, and it's kind of like that. It is really like that. It's hundreds of thousands of things. It's photographs and letters, correspondence between Houdini and Keller back and forth, like text messaging, years and years of getting letter by letter by letter and putting like a conversation, a 9-year conversation between two famous guys. One guy was Keller, who was the model of The Wizard of Oz. When L. Frank Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz, he modeled it after Harry Keller because he was the famous magician at the time. One of the magicians that Houdini really, really loved was Keller. And so I have all their correspondence, all their stuff. And it's really amazing to read that and to see the props that were touched by these people. And what do you do, from there? My secrets are on the moon. Do you know about that?
I do know that. Yeah. What's the story there?
Well, there's an Archmission Foundation etches into nickel. Nickel doesn't degrade. And a billion years from now, nickel will still remain a constant, doesn't lose its form. And you've heard of microfiche. We've kind of done, this is like nanofish, really small. With a microscope, you can see this thing. And it was this package of knowledge, with some of it, my illusions and my secrets, were blasted off and crash landed on the moon. It didn't land the way we wanted it to land, but it did land. And it's an amazing feeling to go outside and look at the moon and say, wow, my stuff is there. If somebody takes time to find it, you could actually see my secrets on the moon.
Yeah. You better hope that none of your competitors, get Jeff Bezos to take them to the moon or something.
They got to bring a metal detector because we're not exactly sure where it is.
Okay, perfect then. Well, I want to talk about some of the people that you feature in this book. And it's so fun because you use the props and the apparatus to tell the story of all these famous magicians. And so many of them are just fascinating. I don't think there's any magician who would argue with me if I said that anyone who goes into this business has at least a little bit of larceny in them. And one of my favorite things about the history of magic is just the sordid stories of so many magicians. Perfect example, Alexander, the Man Who Knows. This guy was always working an angle, wasn't he? He was basically a con man.
He was a con man, very interesting guy. He had the turban, the famous classic poster, as much as any magician in history. He did very well financially. Taxes were new taxes came up, and he just paid in cash, millions of dollars sitting on the table like that. So he was a interesting character. We heard he killed somebody.
I heard that too. It wasn't mentioned in the book, but I've heard that rumor. What's the story there?
A friend of mine went to see his son, who was in his 90s, and didn't know how to bring it up. Says, did your dad, Alexander, the man who knows, is it true that he killed somebody? And the son said, somebody? How many people do you want? It was more than one, apparently, according to this.
Yeah, an incredible story. And yeah, I think at one point you mentioned that he blackmailed someone or threatened to kill someone who was trying to, I don't know what that would be, ransom or trying to extort money from them.
Yeah, he was an interesting character. But then this is the inspirational characters too. There's so many good people in magic and women in magic. Adelaide Herman, after her husband passed away, she carried on the show, would catch bullets in the air and inspired other women to do something that they weren't supposed to, in quotes, do, to be a female in our art form. And there's so many great ones today. So many. I hope they overtake the men, actually. There's so many great female magicians out there. So I'm really proud that, we can tell stories of the ones that came before them.
Yeah. I mean, when we think about the traditional magician in our imagination, we usually picture, maybe a slightly older white guy in a tuxedo. And there are probably some who might argue that magic has had its fair share of sexism and misogyny with, scantily clad female assistants getting sawn in half. But your book does feature a couple of women who really took center stage, and you sort of tell the overshadowed history of women in magic.
I think it's starting to change in a big way, with AGT and a lot of the Broadway shows. We're seeing more women who are really very talented in magic. So I think we're at a good time now because the qualities are very good and very original ideas and approaches to this art form.
And one thing that comes out in here is just how hard the women worked, whether it's Adelaide Herman or I forget the name of the other one. I mean, just constantly worked.
Did lots of shows at, big spectacular shows. Adelaide Herman did for sure. And just to kind of inspire people. And I love that.
Now, I want to talk about someone who was kind of the opposite of Alexander. He did magic, but he presented himself as sort of a seer, the man who could predict the future and new things. And I heard stories that I guess he had a whole pool of secretaries who would type fortunes that he would send to people for 25 cents. On the other hand, you have Houdini, who, he spent a good portion of his life trying to expose these kind of flim-flam artists who preyed on people's vulnerabilities. He spent a lot of his life focused on that. And you have a huge collection dedicated to Houdini as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was a time where spiritualists would be there. Alexander, the man who knows, was not really that. Houdini was debunking people that were trying to bring back dead relatives. It was after the war, so a lot of people were grieving, and there were spiritualists that would claim to have seances to bring relatives back, and they were using magic effects to make that happen. And Houdini was exposing them because it was a real problem at the time.
And you have some of his most famous props, like the milk can escape and the water torture cell. What was Houdini for you, and why does he still loom so large in magic?
I think people can relate to this idea. Houdini's idea was not so much of a magician. He was an okay magician, but the idea of escaping from things was something that people could really relate to. People could associate escaping from, a jail, or associate, not that everybody dreamed about going to jail, but the idea of having the ability to thwart authorities and do that. That's a very relatable idea. And that's why his name maintains as a vital, force in magic, but it's mostly as an escape artist, I think.
He also took magic outside of the theater. And I have to say, I can certainly see a certain lineage from Houdini's big public stunts, like being thrown off of a bridge in a locked trunk or hanging upside down off a building, to the kind of large-scale illusions that you've done in so many of your TV specials. Is that a big influence?
Yeah, I was the first to take big illusion outside, the airplane, Statue of Liberty, all those things, Great Wall of China. So I was the first to do that. But his thing was to take escapes in a natural form, to do it not in the theater, you can't in a theater jump into a lake, right? So you had to do it outside, to hang with a straitjacket above a crowd of people that were there. We did the Fires of Passion. You can look that up, and you can on the YouTube machine and see what we did with burning ropes and kind of take that to another level. But Houdini certainly started that whole escape idea and really captured people's imagination.
Another one that I have to talk about, and I don't know if he really fits into the Alexander category, but magic has certainly had its history of cultural appropriation. You have many acts and illusions that sort of played on Western fascination with exotic places like India and China, the Middle East. But there is this one magician who I've always had a fascination with, who really took it to extremes in a way that would probably not be so okay. I'm talking about a man named William Robinson, a.k.a. Chung Ling Soo. Can you tell me about him?
Sure. He was a guy that was an amazing inventor and assistant of many famous magicians. He saw Qing Ling Fu. Qing Ling Fu had great success in America, a real Chinese individual, and had a big show and in the press a lot. And he saw how people reacted to the Orient as kind of a conceit, kind of umbrella of an idea. We had a fascination with Egypt because it was new territory to Western world and also China and even Japan. So many people appropriated, which again would not work today at all, pretended they were from Asia, both Chinese and Japanese. And Chung Ling Soo was this white guy who did this thing, and it was a pretty remarkable show. He was a very talented magician. Eventually got killed on stage doing the bullet catch, and he caught it not the way he wanted to catch it. It was a flaw in the gun, and he got killed. And people believed he was Chinese. They really believed it. So he was a magic effect up until the end. Chung Ling Soo was rushed to the hospital, and they started to take off his costume and his makeup to treat his wounds. And they discovered, wait a minute, where's Chung Ling Soo? It was a white guy. It wasn't this Chinese guy. So it was a magic effect to the very end.
And you have the gun that killed him in your collection, right?
Yeah, one of the guns used in the show, we think it's the gun that killed him, but he had multiple guns on stage firing at him. Pretty amazing individual, yeah.
Now, for every Chung Ling Soo and Alexander, there are magicians, as you mentioned a moment ago, who really were good souls, loved people. I tend to think that the baseline or the norm among magicians is that they love performing, they love mentoring, signing autographs and that kind of thing. A perfect example of that is Harry Blackstone, probably the best example. You know a lot more magicians than I do, including some from, I guess, this earlier generation. Have you ever heard anyone say a bad word about Blackstone Sr.? I haven't.
Houdini would have said bad words about him.
Oh, really? Why?
Yeah, Houdini and Keller did not like Blackstone. We're talking Blackstone Sr. I have all these letters between the two of them as we talked about him. Houdini didn't like Blackstone at all. Blackstone did do some escapes, Houdini-like escapes, kind of copying what Houdini did. So I'm not sure where that started off, but he wasn't a big fan of his. And we have a picture of Bess Houdini being floated by Blackstone Sr. after she was a widow. So it's Houdini's probably looking down from heaven watching a guy he really wasn't a fan of, Blackstone, levitating his wife. So it's kind of interesting, the layers of stories. But generally speaking, Blackstone was kind of a beloved figure, kind of a grandfatherly figure. He'd give away rabbits during the show. He was very kind of a warm personality. So I know what you're talking about.
Sort of a funny guy. He's one of the people who brought humor into magic. I always think of the posters that he had that would say something like 25 gorgeous women and one ugly one or something in his act.
I want that poster. I don't have that one.
Yeah. I wish that I could have seen him in his heyday. I've heard so many great things.
There's movies of him doing shows.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I'll have to check that out. I want to talk a little bit more about mentorship and that sort of thing. There's a more contemporary magician in this book who you say played a pivotal role in your own life. His name was Channing Pollock. How did he inspire you?
Well, he was great. He did this, 12-minute act. He invented a few things, but mostly it's because of his style. He was very elegant. The work was really perfection. Produced doves, and he was like a movie star, handsome. He was this amazing, kind of iconic guy who eventually got the chance to be in movies, that he didn't enjoy after a while, so he quit. But, Channing was a great guy. I got to know him later in life in his 80s. And he inspired me as a kid because there was an excellence to his work. Worth looking him up on YouTube, Channing Pollock.
Yeah, I will. And I think one of the things that you talked about is how he stripped down the magic act, how it wasn't so clunky. Because, a lot of magic tricks, they'll have false bottoms that seem obvious. A table is too thick, suspiciously so, or things like that. And he got rid of all the distraction, kind of the things that you look at and you say, okay, something must be happening there behind the scenes,
He was doing, pure sleight of hand with doves and cards and just very, very elegantly presented. And he was also just a good guy. Yeah.
And when you think of Harry Blackstone, him, Di Vernon, there's so many magicians who really encouraged and mentored successive generations. Do you see your museum and some of your other projects as a way of inspiring future magicians?
I hope so, but I see it not just to inspire magicians, it's to inspire filmmakers, artists, musicians. So many people come through here and find a new voice by being here. J.J. Abrams, over to the side there, he has a mystery box, what's called. He signed one for me over there. But he was inspired as a young magician. And his whole TED Talk, which I recommend, is a TED Talk about the mystery box and why he never opened it up, how it informed his storytelling and his movie making. So a lot of people were touched by magic in a very profound way. Orson Welles, obviously, J.J. Abrams, Walt Disney loves magic. And, there's a lot to be learned here, not just to become a magician, but to be better at what you're doing in other art forms.
Just last night, I was actually watching Orson Welles' documentary, F is for Fake. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it seems like it's essentially one big excuse for him to do magic tricks on film.
He loved it. He loved doing magic. We've got a whole display of him in here with his stuff. He hosted my first special, so it's a pretty heady thing. Yeah.
Now, do you think that the museum will ever be open to the public? Like, what is the long-term plan, either later on or after you're gone? What are you thinking?
Well, currently, we do exhibitions for the public outside of here. We take exhibitions, we bring to New York. So people do get to interact with these stories and props and ephemera. We do take them out on the road. I traveled with them when I was touring my show exhibitions. We did it in New York, did it in LA. So we do that. The book is a way of experiencing the museum. Maybe someday there's a way of making it so it's for the public. Right now, there's so many secrets involved here, and you can touch everything that it would be very difficult to have the public come here en masse.
That's a good point. Good point. Well, before we go, you must always be thinking about your next illusion. And I guess now that you have, made the Statue of Liberty disappear, made a jet disappear, walked through the Great Wall of China, you've levitated across the Grand Canyon. What is the next big challenge that you're thinking about down the road?
Well, we're working on it. We've got a whole bunch of things that deal with making the world better. If I can inspire people to really, from a different point, to improve how we live and improve, the world, stand by. That's what I'm working on.
Okay. Can't wait to see that. Well, again, the book is called David Copperfield's The History of Magic. It has tons of beautiful photographs. It's a great gift. Anyone would really enjoy this, whether you're a magic fan or not. David Copperfield, it's been such an honor. Thanks so much for talking with me.
My pleasure.
Thanks again to David Copperfield for coming on the podcast. I cannot even say how much fun this was for me, and I really hope that you enjoyed it too. Order David Copperfield's History of Magic on Amazon, Audible, or wherever books are sold. And visit his website, davidcopperfield.com, to learn more about him and to order tickets to his show at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas. Whether you think you're into magic or not, you really have to see David Copperfield at least once in your lifetime. If you enjoyed today's episode, then subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Detailed reviews are the best way for new listeners to discover the show. Follow us on Facebook at @KickassNewsPod and email me with your comments, questions, and suggestions at comments@kickassnews.com. Kickass News is a part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com and check out some of our other shows like Food with Mark Bittman, Movie Therapy, Investing for Beginners, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, and many others. For now, though, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kick-Ass News.
An Airwave Media Podcast.